All right. Hello and welcome to American Dreamland. I'm Max Chavez.
And I'm Misty Stone.
We're continuing on with our bonus series of interview episodes. So today we're joined by former U.S. Attorney Bud Cummins. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
And I'll let you give your kind of preferred biography and why you want to talk to us today. But I do feel I would be remiss, especially given some of the things we mentioned in our last episode about my just nerdy political high school career, is I remember caring about the U.S. attorney scandal in 2006. So very interesting to kind of full circle moment. But
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were interested in that. Sometimes I feel like I'm Forrest Gump. I just kind of turn up in these controversies. I'm not particularly a well-known person or a nationally known person, but somehow I turn up in the picture sometimes, and that has happened to me on several occasions, including the U.S. attorney firing. During our discussions today, I mean, we can use that as an example. That was seen as an episode of political weaponization of justice even back then, and we're seeing a lot of that today as we talk about the justice system, uh, the need to try to firewall politics out of justice.
so yeah, I think speaking of as you mentioned, actually something I had in my notes, Forrest Gump like quality. Why don't you more formally introduce yourself to the audience? Like I said, you were a former U.S. attorney, I believe, for District of Eastern Arkansas.
Eastern District of Arkansas, which is based in Little Rock, the state
Okay.
capital. I was I live in Little Rock. Before that, I'll just kind of roll backwards a little bit. I actually ran for Congress when I was 37 and almost pulled it off, but didn't. Uh, Later served as Governor Mike Huckabee's chief legal counsel for a time, and then was appointed by President Bush to be the United States Attorney, which is a great honor and probably certainly the most fun I've had in my career and most interesting thing I've gotten to do in my career. But I was U.S. Attorney for 5 years. I was among those who were quote fired when Alberto Gonzales became the Attorney General, and that kind of rolled into a needless controversy. It was just, and we can talk about that. I can tell you more about, but it boiled down to a bunch of mid-level officials at the Department of Justice that either wanted themselves or their friends to get to be U.S. attorneys before the second Bush term ended, and they kind of engineered it. And then when they got called for it, they tried to explain it away. It's always a cover up. They tried to say, well, there was reasons these people were fired. It was performance. And that just simply wasn't true. They were just trying to move some people out to make room for some people they wanted to get to be U.S. attorneys. And so if they had just told the truth, it was kind of a nothing burger, but because they had the right, every U.S. attorney serves at the pleasure of the president. If they ask you to go, you go, but they tried to misrepresent it, and that turned it into it opened the door to making it into a much bigger deal. But since then, I have been in the private sector. I have worked as an attorney. I've done government relations, lobbying work. I spent about 5 years, kind of stepped out of the legal world and was at an investment firm. And in 2016, I had really pulled away from politics to quite a bit, but I was asked by Chris Christie to be his state chairman when he ran for president in the 2016 cycle. He and I served together as United States attorneys, and I was happy to do that. So I served as his state chairman. And then when he shut down his campaign and kind of got behind Donald Trump, they asked me to step over and be the state chairman for Donald Trump because, frankly, none of the Republican officials in Arkansas at that stage, you know, wanted wanted to get close to Donald Trump. And so I agreed to do that. And then he asked me to go to Washington for several months and help with the transition that he was leading. So I did that, and that drug me back into politics a little bit. But that's at least hitting the high points of my varied Forrest Gumpish resume. And along the way, I've been involved in some other controversies. I was some Ukrainians approached me about uh, providing some evidence to the Department of Justice about Hunter Biden and his alleged misdeeds in Ukraine and related to the company Burisma. And I made an attempt to discreetly arrange for a meeting, what I thought was an appropriate meeting for Department of Justice and FBI to evaluate whatever they were offering. And but the FBI stonewalled that and refused to review the evidence, and then they investigated me. So, you know, I've I've kind of been in and out of these controversies a time or two.
All right. So,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And that's not all of
Uh,
them. That's just some of them.
yeah. Well, so we can. You did ask to be on for a specific reason, so I'll make sure we can
Yeah.
get to that because I'm already seeing a million ways our brains can branch out. But and I will preface this of like I think what a lot of things when it comes to the matter of law enforcement legal things, I think it's fair to say Misty and I may have differing views, but I do think we all agree in like the fundamental rights against abuses of power. And so you wanted to talk to us about a specific case that happened in Little Rock involving director of the airport Bryan Malinowski. So if you'd like to introduce us to that.
Yeah, thank you. And that is, I did ask. I was not. Usually, I'm invited to be on a TV show or a podcast for some reason or another, but I did ask to come talk about this because it's probably one of the most important things I've worked on in my career, and it remains unresolved. In 2024, in March 19th of 2024. ATF had been investigating the director of the Little Rock Airport, who was a widely respected, uh, the highest paid city employee, made over $260,000 a year, married for 28 years, no criminal record, no kids, and had some hobbies. He was a hobby guy. He had collected coins his whole life. At one point, he kind of dabbled with competing at poker. But he was one of those guys. When he played poker, he read lots of big, thick books about poker strategy, and he had that kind of a brain. He knew everything about coins and the history of coins, and then his father gave him a gun collection that his father was getting older and didn't have any use for it, and he kind of took an interest in guns and started learning about guns. And I don't know what your politics are about gun issues, and your audience may have differing views about gun control and gun issues, but I'd ask them to kind of stick with me on this story because I think that the things that are important here kind of transcend how you feel about the politics in this particular matter. But uh, he found that he liked to go to gun shows, and so he for several years he had become a guy who maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 times a year would go to a weekend gun show. He'd sign up and get a table, a folding table or two, and he would put out not only guns, but he would put out coins and some other stuff. He just was a guy that enjoyed doing that. He made $260,000 a year. I mean, we've run the math. We don't have any records. I don't know how much money he made at gun shows, but if he made $8,000 a year, it's a miracle. He this was purely his hobby. And if you've never been to a gun show, I've been to several, and I do like, do have an interest in firearms. Most of the people at the gun show are there because they are like Bryan Malinowski. You don't want to go to a gun show and go up to a guy behind a table and ask them a question about a 1911 Colt pistol, unless you want to hear about 30 minutes about the 1911 Colt pistol. These people are enthusiasts and they take pride in their knowledge, and that's what they're there for. They love to talk about this stuff and trade stories about this stuff. And I think and it was evident at his funeral, which I attended. Uh, a significant number of people that attended were friends of his who he met at gun shows and sat at those tables and talked all day about guns and other stuff, coins, whatever they talked about. Anyway, this was his hobby. Everyone is entitled to buy and sell guns without obtaining a federal firearms license within a safe harbor that is subjectively defined. If you're a hobbyist, if you're trading your collection, if you're trading to buying or selling or trading to enhance your collection, you're within, pretty clearly within this safe harbor. If you're in the safe harbor and you're not required to get the license, I can sell you a gun, and as long as I am required not to sell it to a minor, but as long as you're not a minor, and I don't know that you're from out of state, I'm not really required to find out. But if I know you're from out of state, I'm not allowed to sell you a gun. Otherwise, I can sell you the gun. I hand you the gun, you give me $300, we're done. I don't have to fill out a piece of paper. I don't have to do a background check, and that's the law. Now, some people don't agree with that, and they think that and they call that the gun show loophole. And sure enough, bad guys know that that's a place they can come buy guns if they find the right guy that's not licensed. And some of these guns turn up in the wrong hands. But if you're legally selling them, that's really under the current law. That's not your responsibility. Bryan had gotten where he was selling some volume of guns in some manner that ATF had decided that he'd crossed this threshold and that he was now required to go buy a $200 federal firearms license and comply with their rules. In other cases like this, and I'm a former U.S. attorney, I'm fairly aware. Number one, this is a low level violation among the things that a U.S. attorney's office would prosecute. Number two, it's the kind of thing, a regulatory violation, that you would expect maybe them to send him a sternly worded cease and desist letter. Hey, we've seen you at the gun show, too many guns, whatever. You need to get a license or you need to stop. And then he can hire a lawyer and argue with him. He can do whatever he wants to do. And if he just ignores them and they want to, pursue him criminally, then that's, at least he's had fair notice. None of that happened in this case. Bryan had no idea that he was under investigation. He made no efforts to conceal his conduct. He was out there in front of God and everybody at these gun shows. Yet the ATF decided to launch this investigation. They tailed him at night and followed him around town in his car. They put a tracker on his car. And then they ultimately went and obtained a federal search warrant, and which they're on its form. Federal search warrants can typically be executed anytime from 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. But this is a person, law enforcement is supposed to make a threat assessment, about before they execute a warrant. What are the conditions here? Is this a known criminal? Is it a known propensity for violence? Is there a threat of escape, for destruction of evidence? Is this a drug case? Can he flush the drugs down the toilet if we knock on the door? There's nothing on that list except that they knew he owned guns, which there's cases that say that in and of itself is really not a reason to consider what we call an exigent circumstance. And so
So
they came to, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, just to kind of go into that is, I mean, as you said, this seems like a regulatory violation,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like a lot of resources were spent, kind of going into this. So I am wondering,
Amazing.
just in terms of, and again, we not trying to assuage guilt or do anything, but was there anything like uh, like 3 buyers later a gun was used in a crime somewhere?
Yeah.
Did one of these guns end up in Arkansas, or was there even any base rationale to be able to kind of initiate this kind
If we
of?
can assume that everything they said in their affidavit attached to the search warrant that's supported this obtaining a search warrant is accurate, they had identified some firearms that traced back to him in police encounters. So they documented 5 firearms that they used the phrase were used in the commission of crime. Well, that to me that conjures up an image of somebody doing a drive-by shooting or walking in a bank and sticking the gun in somebody's nose. But then if you read the details, 3 of them were confiscated by police in a traffic stop where the police officer found marijuana and the firearm in the car, which is a violation of law. So they confiscated it. So there's three of the commissions of crime. One of them was found in a search of a home in an unrelated case, an unoccupied home with an unoccupied car parked outside, and it was found in the car. And the fifth one, which I think is probably maybe the most troubling, the police had an encounter in California with I think a 15-year-old. It was a minor, a teenager, who had the gun on his person when he was, it had a police encounter, and they confiscated it from this minor. So those were the five cases and each of those they could trace back that the gun was originally purchased legally by Bryan Malinowski. So that was their basis for launching the investigation, and I take no issue with that. That's kind of the job we give the ATF. And I'm not here really to argue. We'll never really know if he was in violation of this regulation at the end of the day, because we don't know everything, and Brian's dead. I mean, spoiler alert: Brian is no longer with us, but it's not really a question of whether he was in violation of this low level regulation. He may have been, maybe not. Based on what I know, I could argue that he might not have been, but they did know that. But what we also know from their post shooting statements, the Arkansas State Police did a investigation. They had convinced themselves that they were onto something really big because he was the airport director, and that maybe he was somehow using the airport to transship guns to cartels, or they talked about those kind of things. They said, well, we heard that he played competitive poker, and we thought maybe that was meant money laundering. So they make these huge leaps with no justification whatsoever. Yes, he did run the airport. There was no evidence that he was using that access to the airport for anything connected to firearms, but they had convinced themselves they might be into a really big deal. And the other explanation for why they threw all the resources I described and the ones I'm about to describe at this, that I think is pretty obvious, but someone could disagree, is this is an investigation that probably doesn't take place. And again, you can have your own personal feelings about these politics. Under a Republican administration, this is not a priority, and this whole investigation doesn't even take place because the Republicans are not concerned about the gun show loophole. The Democrats, it's one of their leading gun control issues. If you go to the Brady website or the Everytown, any of the gun control advocacy websites, this is an issue that is one of their headline issues that they think needs to be fixed with legislation. That's been a political debate for I'm older than you, probably most of your adult life. And it hasn't changed. I mean, Congress has spoken on this issue multiple times, and so far they have maintained that they want to not require every citizen to fill out paperwork and do a background check when they sell a gun. So different administrations, it's a crime. The next administration, it may be nothing. They're not going to look at it. That's a little troubling in and of itself. If you go look at the definition of how they try to explain to you when you've crossed this line, it's so subjective that you could put 100 lawyers in a room and have them all read the regulation, and they come out with 100 different versions or explanations of what's allowed. But the final thing is the Biden administration was in the process of changing that rule. It was not effective yet. It became effective. Their version of it became effective about a month after Bryan Malinowski's death. They claimed, politically to the media that they were closing the gun show loophole. They really didn't. They tightened up the definition a little bit. But I believe, and I can't prove it to you, but I worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office. When the President of the United States is going to speak to a law enforcement issue, everybody knows about it in the system for a while. And they might send out an email that says, hey, we're about to make this new rule effective, and the president's going to, make a statement about it. If anybody has, an important case that falls under this, let us know here in the communications department, DOJ. We might want to, talk about it when the president makes his announcement. I sort of believe that drove some of the effort, some of this amazing effort and resources that went into this case. They had a high profile executive that they thought they admit that they kind of thought he was doing a whole lot of things he clearly wasn't doing, and so they followed him, and then they got the search warrant. But the search warrant could have been executed by knocking at his door on a Saturday at noon. There, he lives in a nice new suburban area with a nice green lawn and a quiet neighborhood and about a 3,000 square foot house, and kept very regular hours, parked in the same parking spot at work every day, worked in a gun-free zone. They could have walked in his office and told him they had a search warrant and asked him to go out to the house, and there was no danger. But instead, they chose to come out with 10 carloads of ATF and Little Rock Police Department, who they asked to come work the perimeter. 10 carloads pulled up to his house at 6 a.m., over an hour before sunup, on a 32-degree morning on March 19th, 2024. They approached the front door dressed in tactical gear. And I want to be careful here and make it clear. They looked like a SWAT team, but they weren't a SWAT team. They were dressed up like a SWAT team. These were not a SWAT team is a designated group of agents who are on the SWAT team, and they train together on the SWAT team. They go to regional competitions together as a team. This was just a bunch of agents that had access to helmets, ballistic shields, and automatic weapons, and they put all that stuff on, came up to the front door, banged on an exterior insulated glass door. He didn't ring the doorbell, covered up the ring doorbell with tape, the lens of it, banged on the glass, and waited a whole 28 seconds before they started breaking down the glass, and then rammed the wood doors inside open. The Malinowskis never heard the knocking. We know what they heard because Mrs. Malinowski is still with us, and she was laying right next to Mr. Malinowski. He jumped out of bed, thinking obviously that they were being victimized by home invaders. He grabbed a pistol, went to a closet, got a magazine, slapped it into the pistol, went down a hallway, turned a corner, and saw in the darkness a silhouette of a person entering his house with a clearly armed, and he took 3 or 4 shots at that person's feet, and that agent dove out of the way, and the agent came in behind him and returned fire at Bryan Malinowski and mortally wounded him in the forehead. So that's the story. That's what happened, and it has upset a lot of people in the state of Arkansas. As I told you and alluded to earlier, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of public controversy, certainly here locally. I mean, I've been a congressional candidate, and I work for the governor. I've been the U.S. attorney. My name's been in the paper here till my wife wants to, vomit. But I've never been, involved in any public controversy that has had this much attention for this long. People, if I went down to the grocery store with you right now and walked down the frozen food aisle, a 70-year-old woman would probably come up to me and say, Bud, what is going on with the Malinowski case? That was terrible. Are they not going to do anything about that? And it's been over 2 years right now. But that's the problem. The Department of Justice has supervisory responsibility over ATF, and they have never made any type of investigation into this. And the ATF's stance is they've represented that they've referred to him as a significant gun trafficker. I don't know how they get to that, and that they contend that he knew they were law enforcement when he chose to shoot at them, and they don't know why he did that. Well, those two things are absurd. And so, and again, and I'm going to quit talking here and let y'all talk. But as I said, you may advocate for more gun control, and maybe you don't have sympathy for people that sell guns. I mean, that's how we kind of are in politics. Abortion, guns. There's a lot of passion, and people kind of lose their perspective. But you have to put this was your federal government that kicked in a citizen's door at 6 a.m. and killed him in front of his wife over a low-level regulation. Change the facts. What if it was you and you sprayed the wrong pesticide on your lawn and violated an EPA regulation? Let it run down the sewer. What if it was, pick your favorite low level regulation violation? This is a frightening thing. This is basically without any accountability. This is a government kill squad that went out and took out a citizen, and there's been no accountability or consequence. And so that's very troubling to a lot of people that are aware of
Yeah. And I think kind of building off of that, because I've also looked into some of your commentary interviews and then a few news stories about it, is I think there's two things kind of going on here. And I know, Misty, you have a lot about militarization of the police. So I just want to get this in before let you get into that. But you also mentioned that it wasn't just the excessive nature of it; it was the kind of failures in terms of internal policy as well. I'm thinking specifically of the order of officers who go in. I think is something you mentioned. So, like,
it. Hmm.
why do you think those institutional failures occur? I mean, like, I think we've all worked in large organizations. Mistakes happen. Was it just the immediate incompetence of the officers on the ground? How deep do you think the not following of procedure went? And then also, like, does this speak to something more about how we kind of train or utilize our at least federal law enforcement right now?
Well, I think you raised a couple of really interesting questions there. One of them, you mentioned the militarization of law enforcement, and I was a U.S. attorney immediately after 9/11. So I was on the Attorney General's committee to, we basically stood up a domestic counterintelligence program counterterrorism program that didn't exist before 9/11. And there was tons of money. I mean, remember COVID, we had COVID and they just started dumping out these huge government grants. And I've watched how that money's been spent out in the States, and it has very little to do with COVID. It's just kind of the federal government's response to show that they care is they go find $1 trillion more and dump it into the, but that a lot of that went on after 9/11. We were all scared of, thought we were going to be fighting terrorists in the streets. And so there was a ton of money that flowed out of Washington towards law enforcement. And we were buying armored cars for local police departments and buying all this kind of equipment where police departments didn't used to everybody have, automatic rifles and vests and helmets and visors, but we bought a lot of that stuff and we've continued to do it. And we've kind of allowed law enforcement to turn more militaristic than it was back then. And I think that is a legitimate question or a concern. Uh, when most of these agents sign up for the right reasons. I'm not going to sit here and tell you they're bad people. They want to do right. They want to be the good guys. But I'll tell you, most 32-year-old young men in particular, they'd rather be out dressed like Navy SEALs kicking in doors than doing paperwork. And we have really given, particularly federal law enforcement, some massive tools to ruin people's lives, not only violently, but legally. I mean, the power to indict somebody, the sentencing guidelines, it is a awesome responsibility. And I thought when the president made me a U.S. attorney that I was 37 years old. I wanted to come down here, be fire breather. I wanted all the FBI agents when I was done to say that guy was the best crime fighter leader we've ever had, and he knocked down every obstacle so we could. That wasn't really my job. My job was to protect everybody else from those guys. I was the president's representative here to make sure that those massive tools of destructive tools were used prudently and with discretion. And but you know what? They don't teach U.S. attorneys that. And I think this case exposes some really significant leadership and training issues because somebody made a decision to allow these guys to come out at 6 in the morning like that without any justification that I'm aware of. Somebody authorized that at ATF. The judge doesn't, when he signs a warrant, he doesn't tell them how to execute it. That's left the agencies. And we give them that discretion because we're all concerned about officer safety. We want them to be able to make decisions to protect themselves, but they have to have a reason. And somebody made a decision that it was a good idea to go out with that level of force at that hour and use, somebody decided 28 seconds. The law requires that they knock, make themselves announce themselves as law enforcement in a reasonable way, and give the occupant of the house a reasonable opportunity to voluntarily come to the door and admit them. I don't think 28 seconds is reasonable in anybody's book at 6 in the morning on a cold March 32 degrees. I don't know about you, but I don't get my trousers on and find out who's at my front door in 28 seconds. And if they really wanted him to know that somebody was at the door and who they were, why did they tape over the lens of his ring camera? Why do people buy ring cameras? I think it's to find out who's at the front door. So it appears that they had every intention of kicking that door down from the minute they got there, and then they executed it uh, incompetently. The plan called for a guy with one of those bulletproof shields that said police on it to go in first, and for whatever reason, he laid his shield down, and so the guy that was supposed to go in second said he kind of stared at the guy for a minute and just decided he should go in first. So he's the guy that blundered into the front hallway that Mr. Malinowski saw with a gun. And here's another point. They never made enough. You can hear them. All we have is some bad audio, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We don't have any video. We should, but we don't. So we can build this timeline off this audio. You can hear them banging on the door, and they kind of announce that they're police while they're knocking. It's like bam, 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 and while they're bam, 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 they're saying police, and then they stop and there's nothing. And then so you really wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying while they were banging. But they never announce again. Once they decide to tear those doors open, the doors are hanging open. There's double doors hanging open into this home. They could have stood out there and said police. They never did that again. So you have to say that their intentions were not to identify themselves reasonably as law enforcement. It was not to give him an opportunity to voluntarily admit them into the home. And there was incompetence in the way they executed it, particularly in the order they went in the house, but also that their failure to continue to make announcements or to make any effective announcements.
Right. And I think, Bud, you make great points of just, I mean, I don't think anyone deserves to be executed, even if he was doing anything illegal, just over the sale of firearms, regardless how you feel about firearms. I mean, in this country, regardless of how you feel, we have a right to firearms. And it's our right. And, you know, I think there's better channels to prosecute someone than banging down their door. And then I think, there should be I mean, correct me if I'm wrong too, the state of Arkansas has a stand your ground law. And you would
Yep,
think somebody that passionate about firearms
would
also
have
would
that
defend their
mentality.
home, would have that
If I
mentality.
if I had $5 for every person that had walked up to me on the street and said I would have done exactly what Bryan did, I would be retired right now on a boat in the Caribbean. I mean, and this is Arkansas. Gun ownership is widespread here. There's a lot of outdoor hunting and enthusiasts. Most of us own guns. It would be unusual to. There's probably more houses on his street where there are firearms in the house than not, and that's just kind of Arkansas.
Right. And I think, for our audience specifically, they might see parallels to a no knock raid like Breonna Taylor's no knock raid too, and relate to
Yeah,
it on that level. And so I think in that way, um, I think we're seeing that these no knock raids endanger citizens on both sides of the political spectrum and of all races. This isn't just
absolutely.
left or
Well, and this is
right.
not technically a no knock raid because they did knock. They
Mhm.
just did. I've said they knock, but if you do it in a way that can't really be calculated for a person in a master
Mhm.
bedroom in the back of a 3,000 square foot house to hear you, from their perspective, it's a distinction without a difference. From the Malinowski's perspective, laying in their bed at 6 in the morning, it was a no knock raid, even though there was some knocking and announcing going on somewhere. You mentioned Breonna Taylor, and that kind of ties into the question about the video that I mentioned. A lot of people about, well, what about where's the body worn camera? The body cam video. We want to see that. Well, that's interesting because when Breonna Taylor, and I don't remember the date Breonna Taylor was killed, but within a year or two, the President Biden signed an executive order that was tied to probably to that. I think maybe the George Floyd, but it was about law enforcement policy, and it specifically mandated that federal law enforcement wear body worn cameras whenever they execute search warrants. Mandated. Didn't say later, let's all work toward. It said required. Pretty soon thereafter, the Assistant Attorney General Lisa Monaco issued all agency memorandum, mandatory. Every agency will develop policies and shall wear body worn cameras when executing search warrants. This was 2 years after that. There not one agent had on a body worn camera, and even more interesting, the Little Rock Police Department has a similar policy. And those officers that were present were not wearing their body worn cameras. And we'd love to know who made that decision. The ATF has said, well, we didn't have body worn cameras because they were never funded by Congress. And so we've had to roll them out incrementally since that order in the places we thought we needed them the most. And we hadn't gotten to Little Rock yet. Well, that may be a good bureaucratic answer, but when you go read an executive order and then a policy memo signed by the Deputy Attorney General that doesn't have any qualifying language that says shall wear 2 years before that, and they didn't do it, it's really not a very good answer. And here, it 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 certainly has fueled those who have conspiracy, are inclined to conspiracy theory. It certainly has fueled that.
And I just imagine if you have all this money for tactical gear, regardless, you would have money for cameras.
Well, and I highlight the fact that this was not a SWAT team. I actually kind of referred to it as a SWAT team early on many times. My co-counsel Nathan Garrett is is a Kansas City attorney who I've worked with many times. Nathan's background, he started as a Missouri State Trooper, and then he was an FBI agent, and he was on an FBI SWAT team. He was a SWAT team guy, and then he was a assistant United States attorney, and now he's a private practicing attorney. He's also served on the Kansas City, Missouri Police Commission. So he has a pretty deep law enforcement background, and he's about as pro law enforcement as I think you can get. But he's working on this case with me, and and to Nathan and to a number of other people that have come to me that do or have served on SWAT teams. That's an important distinction to them, because what I hear a lot from them is not only did these guys do it all wrong and they weren't trained to do it, but they said if they had called a real SWAT team and said, "Hey, we want you to come support this. We're going to execute this search warrant at 6 a.m. and we want to have a SWAT team," they'd have hung up on them because there was nothing about this case that justified rolling out a real SWAT team. So they dressed up like a SWAT team and tried to pretend like they were one. And that's troubling that somebody gave them the tools to do that, that somebody authorized that, and that 2 years later, nobody's held anybody accountable for those decisions.
Yeah, I think kind of, and again, like looking through some of the other things, and I think like this case really ties into it, is like you've mentioned a lot about how in some of your other work how important public trust is
Yeah.
to kind of maintain law enforcement, and to kind of, and again, we can tie it back to the Malinowski case, but I guess the more devil's advocate question I ask is like, I know you said a lot like, man, I wish we could not play politics or put them aside, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess I guess my thing is that's difficult. I don't know how certain things work in a place like Arkansas. Obviously, you have a lot of federal experience, but like in California, we have our chief law enforcement people are district attorney, attorney general, things like that. People like yourself, while just appointees, do have to get Senate approval, which is all locked in. So, how do we? And to be fair, I understand that. I think that it's good as a public source. I think there should be more public commissions and stuff, but like us having a say in like the people instructing law. But obviously, I'll speak to LA because I'm very familiar with that. The DA is such a political position. Like they spend just as much money as like the mayor. The DA may actually have more power because it's a weak mayor system. So like how do we find the right balance of like the political reality and some of the safeguards we have to, make sure that, you've made the accusation that like the Biden admin wanted a, very shiny looking prize to like promote a thing. I I don't think it's unfair to say every administration has done that. Like
Oh,
they
absolutely.
so like
Absolutely.
how do we like make sure we have that right balance?
Well, number one, I want to start off by saying when people start talking about this, they tend to drift off into if it could only be like it used to be. And I can tell you, it's never been perfect. If you want to talk about federal law enforcement, go look at J. Edgar Hoover and the COINTELPRO program and their investigations of civil rights leaders and particularly Martin Luther King. I mean, that's not really the world we want to live in. And most people, I think that J. Edgar Hoover really kept kind of blackmail files on all kinds of public officials, and we don't want to put that kind of power in someone's hand. And that was started before I was born. So we've
And
had problems. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, just to kind of build off of that, like I think very famously there's Martin Luther King and the blackmail files, but I mean, I think there's a direct tie, and we mentioned Breonna Taylor, but heavily armed police, unclear reason, not giving fair warning. That sounds a lot like the Fred Hampton situation back in the 60s. So, and I do think that goes into, it was, I think, for political reasons and obviously like for the promotion of that. So you're right, it is in the system. So, like, is there an answer in the past, or then what would
Yeah.
be the way
Well,
forward?
I think that this is actually one of the rare issues. We have a lot of division in this country politically. I think we all know that. And like I said, if you can't really find empathy for Bryan Malinowski because you hate guns so badly and you wish that guns would be confiscated, and a lot of people believe that, and I'm not here to debate that. Pretend like maybe we in their infinite wisdom, the state of Arkansas has made it illegal for a doctor to give an abortion. What if it had been a doctor's house that they thought was giving an abortion? Maybe that's your issue, and you're pro-choice, and so substitute that and put that guy in the bedroom at 6 in the morning. It's about government authority. It's about trust. And what I've said, I'm also pro law enforcement, and I continue to be. But it saddens me, and just for a number of reasons. Some of the you know some people are more concerned about George Floyd than others. Breonna Taylor, uh, the prosecutions of Donald Trump, the non investigations of the Clinton Foundation and Hunter Biden. I mean, everybody's got, it's hard to keep your politics out of your opinions on these things. But what it all boils down to is lost trust in the system. And I think our law enforcement system depends a lot on trust. And, if the FBI comes and puts cuffs on your brother in law and takes him down to the courthouse, you kind of need to believe that at that moment that he may have done something wrong and it's a serious matter. If you think it's because he gave a political contribution to the wrong candidate or that he just his personality offended somebody that has the power to go out and punish people they don't like, the whole system kind of falls apart. And I think we see a lot more individuals. You see it on the social media. I think a lot of it's staged, but social media where people resist arrest and don't obey lawful orders of police officers on the side of the road. Man, that's dangerous stuff. We need to have law enforcement have the respect and the authority to keep people if you have a problem with getting pulled over, take the ticket, hire a lawyer, go to court. That's what it's for. You're not allowed to refuse to because it ends badly. Sometimes it ends badly for the officer too. But I think all of these matters that, whether you're talking about Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe or the George Floyd situation, these all tend to erode the public's confidence in law enforcement in one way or the other. So I think it's something we can come together on actually as a divided country, because no matter what, you know, your particular sensitivities are politically, we all have an interest in having a government that is not targeting people because of their politics, that is not using excess force, is not using heavy handed prosecution tactics. We all have an interest in that. And I think that that should be our common goal. I don't know that there's a magic wand, but I watched what happened. I am a conservative and I'm a Republican, and I'm very critical of some things that happened during the Obama and the Biden administration at the Department of Justice that we now know. I mean, whether you want to talk about the Russian collusion investigation or some of the unequal approaches to Donald Trump's handling of classified information and Joe Biden's handling of it, their refusal to investigate Hunter Biden or their refusal to investigate Hillary Clinton's emails further or to the Clinton Foundation. We could talk about any of those, and I have some criticisms in it. But you could also, now since President Trump's been elected, he has been very visibly wanting to use DOJ in some people's mind to target his political opponents. It looks like retribution, I think, fairly to a lot of people. And, if I wanted to defend him, I'd say, well, he's not doing anything worse than what they did to him. But that's not what we want for the Department of Justice. We don't want him to do that. We don't want Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe to do it. We don't want the Department of Justice to be deciding who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and then you know choosing who to investigate until they find something wrong because they don't like the guy. That's kind of become part of the culture there, and I've seen it not only in these political cases, but I've seen it in cases you've never heard of, where the Department of Justice has the power to, and a lot of it is probably on the backs of Republicans and conservatives. We're the law and order guys in the 80s and 90s that passed a lot of these, fairly tough criminal sentencing laws, but now they're used in ways sometimes that I see that I just don't think are fair. They indict people that really have a story that you'd think that if they wanted to, they should have a chance to explain their conduct to a jury, and they simply can't because the consequences of going to jury trial and getting punished are so much greater than what they're offered in a guilty plea that, and I've seen it. I wouldn't have believed it when I was U.S. attorney, but I've seen it too many times to deny it now. People walk in and admit to conduct that they know they didn't do to get a guilty plea to cut off their exposure to the cost of defending themselves and the possible consequences under. And that's really not how the justice system's supposed to work. So there's a lot of cultural problems there. I think there's a lot of training problems at the Department of Justice. I think that they kind of use the length of some of these sentences as notches on their belts, and career builders, and don't really properly value liberty. I mean, some of these sentences I've seen are just crazy what they're putting people in prison for. Nonviolent first offenders going to prison for 15 or 20 years because, they're not, they're Keith Raniere, the Nexium. I don't know if you know who that is. There was a HBO series called The Vow. He had supposedly a cult called Nexium. If he'd call it a self-help. They ran like 20,000 people through these seminars, so there was something going on there. But they prosecuted him, and his sentence was 120 years. And the worst thing I'm aware of that they tried to prove was that he had pictures of an underage girl on his computer. Now there's a penalty for that, but it's not 120 years. So I just think that I wish that someone would try to rebuild this from the ground up and just take a little bit different approach to the training and the militarization and the use of force. But I may be a dreamer, but certainly to get the politics out of it. I think it's undeniable that Bryan Malinowski's dead in part because it was an administration that prioritized closing the gun show loophole and prosecuting people that they viewed were in violation of it. And to me, that's political weaponization.
Eh, I mean, kind of going along with that is what role do you think? I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles during the OJ trial, so
Mm-hmm.
obviously we got a lot of interesting views of law enforcement and a lot of interesting opinions happening locally. But
And
but
Rodney King.
yes, but kind of I think something interesting is like how much do you think this like distrust is compounded by like you mentioned all of this like the like average person like getting just abused by the system and then just I know this isn't all federal but I was just thinking of like yeah something we've covered on the podcast and kind of we've kind of talked about some of the stories that have come out from the Duggard family on your part of the country and like how much like police officers were involved and just kind of like oh it's fine. I'll like to be devil's advocate. I mentioned George Gascon. He replaced the reason he was district attorney is he replaced someone called Jackie Lacey who kept overruling law enforcement when this top Democratic donor, Ed Buck, kept having gay prostitutes die in his house. It was just a weird thing that kept happening. And it took a massive local effort that I had friends part of. So like, and then of course, obviously the million things with Epstein. And I think whatever our politics, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Misty, we're happy if Bill Clinton has to go to trial for that. I don't have any problem.
Yeah.
But like we hear these stories of like people getting away with things or, you
Mhm.
know, going back to Epstein is like, all right, you got to go to prison for 3 hours a day and then you get to go to New York on the weekend. Like, what role is that playing? And then like, it's not just optics, but like, how do we make it so that even if there's some politics at the back end, like we're punishing more the injustice rather than the individual, if that makes sense.
Well, part of what you covered there that is, I think, important is there's a lot of frustration when you look at how they handled Epstein early on. There's a lot of frustration. Uh, like I said, I'm frustrated that they didn't think Bill Clinton's the Clinton Foundation raising tens or hundreds of millions of dollars while his wife was the Secretary of State and it was coming from foreign government that wasn't worth a peek. I mean, but again, it's kind of pick your own. Some people are concerned about George Floyd, some people are concerned about the Clinton Foundation, but you you see you're frustrated by things like that. But elections have consequences. And when we elect a prosecuting attorney, a lot of prosecuting attorneys are elected, or a mayor, or a governor, or an attorney general, or we elect a president who appoints the attorney general and appoints U.S. attorneys. There's consequences to that. I don't like the way Jim Comey did his job, but somebody gave him that authority. He didn't do it well. I worked with Jim Comey. He and I were U.S. attorneys together before he went on to bigger and better things. I don't approve of the way he used that authority, but I don't know that there's a consequence for him except to take the job away from him. These elections have consequences. So we have to elect people that prove to us that they understand these core principles about, especially, about the administration of justice and the use of these awesome powers that we give people. That we don't expect them to use them politically. We don't expect them to give their friends free rides, and we want it again. It'll never be perfect, but uh, it's done. I've seen it done really well, and certainly a lot better than I've seen it in some of these other instances. And I don't know that there always is I don't know that there always is a remedy for somebody abusing their authority or to ignoring their responsibility when they hold those offices. I think we just have to do better and pay better attention to who we put in those positions. It's in a lot of cases. Is that fair? I mean, you understand?
Oh yeah,
People want a pound of flesh. President Trump wants to prosecute Jim Comey, but I don't personally know that there's a hook there. I think the I'd rather, what I'd like to see, what I'd like to have seen about some of these political issues is more of a truth process. Like Mandela's process. You come in and you tell the truth about what you happened, and you get a free pass. It's more important that we get people to admit what they did and make some draw some conclusions about what's right and what's wrong and try so we don't repeat it in the future than it is to go out and get a pound of flesh out of some individual. I mean, in my opinion. And in a lot of cases, that pound of flesh really isn't available because they
Yeah, I
had
mean,
the authority to do what they did.
yeah, I mean, kind of going on with you is it again when and where I grew up is like plays a huge role of like people are like, oh, these are new things, or like, let's go back to the way. And it's like you said, CONINTELPRO, how we battled gangs in major cities in like the 80s. Us still living, in California, we still have, despite the fact we've legalized marijuana, like for other drugs, we still have some pretty serious mandatory minimums. And
Yeah.
are like gang modifiers in certain cities. So I do think it is, important that we don't just find some arbitrary line and say, no, that's how it was before. So yeah, I do think, and it is difficult because like I said, is I don't like the fact that Tuesday I had to pick the top law enforcement officer of the state, but also like, you're right. It's good we have some kind of pushback to make
Well,
sure it's
that should be on our
our
menu when
values
we
and
decide
stuff.
who to vote for. It maybe should be a higher priority when we decide who to support politically, even at the level of a governor. Or, the a recognition about the importance of personal liberty and not living under a heavy-handed government. I can tell you. I mean, like I said, I've seen people do it right. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General when I became a U.S. Attorney. And I can tell you that guy did it right. And I have great admiration for John Ashcroft. Yeah, I think he'd been a governor, a United States Senator. One of the one of the last check boxes before you got confirmed, you got your name sent over to get confirmed by the Senate after the president had nominated you, was to go have a one-on-one meeting with John Ashcroft, which I can just tell you, I was very scared to death when I went into my one-on-one meeting with the Attorney General, and I thought he was going to ask me a lot of questions, and I was going to have to like come up with really smart answers. I didn't do much talking in that meeting. He was had my resume in his lap, and he looked at me and he said, "Bud, I can see in your resume that you have quite a bit of political background." He said, I have a lot of political background, but I've studied the history of the Department of Justice. And almost every time this department has been, I don't know what word to use, but found itself in a ditch was because somebody lost sight of the separation of politics and justice. And he said, I respect your background and your political background, but if you can't keep that distinction in mind and hang the politics at the door when you exercise the authorities we're going to give you in this job, you're not going to be there very long. And I can just tell you, I don't know if you remember John Ashcroft. He had a very funny, side to him, and could be very entertaining. He was among the senators that went around, the singing
The singing,
senators.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
it
But
was
man, he also had a
him,
hard
Trent
side to him.
Lott, Orrin Hatch, and the Republican who switched, and then in 2000. I I
Oh,
was not lying about being a politics in high school.
well, but John Ashcroft also had a very hard edge to him when he wanted to. Kind of like, he kind of reminded me of a football coach you were a little bit scared of. You wanted to play hard for, and you wanted him to like you. And in that conversation, the hard edge came out, and he was looking right through me. I mean, there wasn't any doubt in my mind when I walked out of that door that I was not to go back to Arkansas and start targeting Democrats that I didn't like. And so it can be done right. It comes from the top, just like that, and it's a culture. And I just think that the culture at the Department of Justice has kind of eroded. I don't know who's to blame. Doesn't really matter at this point. But I think somebody needs to fix it. I look on LinkedIn. I see, I have so many colleagues, former colleagues around the country. When you're a U.S. attorney, there's 93 offices, basically evenly dispersed around the country of somebody who had either was smart enough or politically connected enough to become a U.S. attorney. And it's a great network to have, and it's national. And I really have a lot of respect for a lot of those men and women. I see some of them on LinkedIn, and some of them that were in Republican administrations, and they're among the people who just don't like Donald Trump. He's offensive to them. They think he's an embarrassment, and they talk about it a lot, in on LinkedIn and places, and they bemoan, what the Department of Justice is doing right now, whether it's this $1.8 billion fund to pay weaponization victims, or indicting Jim Comey for putting something sand on the beach in 40, whatever it was, 86, 48, and whatever they're doing. Here's an essay about how the majesty of the Department of Justice and how it's been brought down by this terrible man. And some of the things President Trump's doing, I will readily tell you, I don't agree with. I don't think it's appropriate for the Department of Justice. But like I said, he's not doing anything worse than what they did to him in the last administration, and even going back further. I just don't see how anybody can criticize what he's doing with the Department of Justice without going back and including those other incidents in their analysis and saying we got to fix all this. This is not the problem right here. This guy didn't start the problem. We just we have a cultural problem and a training problem and a leadership problem at the Department of Justice, and somebody needs to fix it.
And I think I know we are kind of at the time we scheduled, so it's okay if we kind of jump towards this. But I think, and this is definitely our perspective, definitely coming from the more left side of things, is part of that general culture we have is, I think, how we treat government officials, how, the kind of systems and bureaucracies are in place. And I think, a slightly more fun, and we cover a lot of conspiracies on the show. So something we're interested in is the Hunter Biden stuff. I know you have a tangential thing about that, but
Mm-hmm.
Msity, I think you had some questions in regards to that as well.
Yeah, I think we were just we were talking about the DOJ, and, you have a deep history, a deep knowledge of the DOJ, as you've discussed. And when we looked at the Hunter Biden investigation and the gun charges that were processed, do you see a weaponized two-tier system, or is it a symptom of a bureaucratic DOJ that handles high-profile political targets differently compared to everyday citizens?
Well, let's face it. I mean, when you're dealing with the president's son, this is the kind of the height of sensitivity when so
Hmm.
whether it's Trump's kids or Hunter Biden or whoever, I think you can expect that the person appointed by their dad to exercise that authority is going to be very restrained in doing it. I get that, but when what I was armed with, and I didn't pretend that I knew that I was contacted by an emissary of the equivalent of the Attorney General in Ukraine, and they said, "Look, we have all this evidence. We have witnesses. We have evidence. We'd like to present it to the Department of Justice privately, not do a press conference. We just want to have a quiet, secret. The Prosecutor General of Ukraine wants to quietly travel to the United States and meet with some high level officials of the Department of Justice and tell them what they have." I just think if you're carrying a badge, you you have an obligation to say, okay, let's hear what you have to say. I told them outright, I had no idea if it was legitimate or not, but I said they've asked me to see to make this connection and help them arrange that meeting. The idea that the entire FBI is set up to just stonewall that, to me, is a little bit troubling. And they did the same thing. There were 3 investigations open to the Clinton Foundation around the country, and the FBI refused to work them. They just wouldn't go. They wouldn't go work them. They would not uh, go do the investigations. There was a U.S. attorney here that went to Washington twice and met with two different attorney generals and was told that they were going to be forced to investigate those cases. I'm not saying that anybody at the Clinton Foundation should have been prosecuted. I don't know. You know what? We'll never know because nobody ever even took a look, and those records are long gone. So we'll never know if there was improprieties there. But again, like, a little troubling if a foreign government can pay the Clinton Foundation $20 million and then suddenly the State Department policy changes. I don't know if that happened. We don't know. We won't ever
I,
know. But
I guess that's kind of
those contributions sure dried up when she left office.
yeah. I guess the reason I bring up, the Hunter Biden thing in particular is that I think, like, regardless of how you feel about the Clinton or the Clinton Foundation thing, I understand what is being accused, that there is corruption, there is funding, the accusations. Again, I don't
Mm-hmm.
have any of the evidence and stuff. I guess with the Hunter Biden thing is a lot of it is just a lot of there's smoke, but is there necessarily a fire? Because one, all of the corruption is like standard amongst children of political elite. And then I guess maybe this is like personal experience, but like I was never able to see like you said, like this dropped off after Clinton left office or these policies aligned. Whereas a lot of times when I see, I'm thinking specifically of like the big guy emails. I guess I don't throw too much weight into them because it's like I've dealt with a lot of drug addicts. They love to lie, and if your dad is vice president, you're gonna go, "Oh yeah, I'll totally talk to him. Just give me a diamond, Chinese businessman." Like it
Yeah,
just sounds like
I'm
drug
not
addict
that.
talk.
I mean, Hunter Biden clearly had a drug problem, and he, apparently had a tax problem. But the fact that people were paying him for influence, that goes on. Uh, I don't know that anybody really got anything for it. Although, his dad was in charge of the Ukrainian policy as vice president at that time, and you've heard the stories about him going over. It is a little unusual for the vice president of the United States to go to Ukraine and demand that they fire the prosecutor general, the specific guy in their bureaucracy. Those things are, kind of raise an eyebrow. But, and again, President Trump's kids are probably out making a lot of money. I'm not sure any, I don't know what they're making or where it's coming from. I know that people that oppose President Trump certainly have raised questions about it. Uh, I don't know that there's an easy fix at that level for these really political. And I guess I'm a little less concerned about them turning a blind eye than I am about them going out and targeting somebody and investigating him until they can find some excuse to prosecute him. And I think if that happened with Trump, and I really have a problem with a 2 year special counsel investigation of a president of the United States for an allegation they called Russian collusion that they knew from the beginning was bought and paid for by his political opponents, yet they allowed that investigation to be steered by people who were politically opposed to him within the Department of Justice, and then wrote, a 500-page report that said, we didn't find Russian collusion, but here's a bunch of just nasty stuff about Donald Trump we think you ought to know before we exit the building. I mean, that's all wrong. And those kind of things, we can't give these powers to people that think it's okay to use them to target their opponents. We should investigate the crap out of something when we think a crime has occurred and then find out if a crime has occurred and who's responsible for it. We shouldn't pick out people that we don't like and just start looking everywhere in their linen closet until we think we found something. And, frankly, I have probably a minority opinion about the Epstein files. I'm really not sure under what authority or what the good policy reason was for releasing all that. Typically, when law enforcement, your government uses its power to come take your information, they come in your house, go through, you bring your file cabinets down to the FBI and go through every page. The public that is not supposed to see all that unless they introduce it in evidence in a public trial. That's the only time the public's supposed to see anything the government has used its power to seize from a private citizen. I don't really know why it was a good policy decision to release the Epstein files, which to my knowledge didn't really prove anything. It just drug a lot of people's names through the mud. Some of them probably guilty of something, some of them not just happened to have some connection to Epstein that had nothing to do with sexual misconduct. I just think that was bad policy, and apparently it was supported on a bipartisan basis. So I don't think I'm picking on the president or anybody else, but I think we ought to really have a conversation about that, because I don't know that that should become the norm. Every time they do a big investigation, go, well, we didn't find anything, but man, we found out some juicy stuff, so we're going to give it to the New York Times to let y'all read about it.
I, I'm
That's not
yeah.
good.
I think that kind of deals with like the difficulty of like where we're doing, because it's like, we agree like cops shouldn't just like be poorly trained, go in for like ticketing violations and stuff. There's like a million examples of that. But then the flip side of that is it's like I think, you know, institutions exist for a reason. They're important to have them, and sometimes they have to make unpopular decisions. But like we said, you need to be trust, and it is like I've lost count of the number of presidents Epstein has had personal connections with, and then just so many questions, how many prime ministers of various countries, and then also just like
Mm-hmm.
weird things that don't make sense, like how did he make $1 billion? Why
Oh,
was
there's a million great questions there, and
yeah
but that's kind of, I would have liked my government, who does have the authority to gather the information, to investigate it and answer those questions to their satisfaction, because there might have been some really big issues there that are of importance to this country, not just the criminal justice system. But I don't know that just dumping a bunch of millions of random pieces of paper out on the internet for people to troll through is good policy.
uh,
It's
I'm I'm
I
sure
think we
giving
may
a
regret that in the
third
future.
generation New Yorker who spent his entire life in the United States, a naturalized citizen Austrian passport in the early 80s, has no questions whatsoever. And
There are so
we
many
have,
questions about that guy that it makes your head spin. I like you say, how did he make all that money? He owned a jumbo jet. Nobody seems to know how he made any money. How can they not know how he made his money? It just seems like you would be able to determine that. I haven't, I'm not a student of the Jeffrey Epstein case, but I've read enough about it that I certainly have questions and concerns. I also think when I was a prosecutor, there were lots of people that I was politically opposed to and didn't like personally or whatever. And this is a small community where I was a prosecutor. We all kind of know each other. And we investigated them because we had a legitimate predicate to investigate him, but for whatever reason couldn't make a case, I decided it wasn't, didn't, I exercised discretion. I think it really didn't merit a federal prosecution. And that meant we were putting information I knew about that person I didn't like, that I would have loved for everyone to have known, back in a box and locking it up. But that's part of the job. And the only reason I knew that is because somebody entrusted me with these awesome powers. And that kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. Uh, it's really, you got to be really careful who you give these powers to. And you got to really hope that we have a culture and leadership that values your privacy, your personal liberty, and your safety from your own government, maybe over everything else. Let's let a bad guy or two go if that's what it costs to not have my government kick my door in at 6 in the morning and kill me.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end it on. And then, Bud, we'd love it if you'd share with us any way our listeners could support Bryan Malinowski's family, how best way to get the word out, put any pressure to investigate this
Yeah,
case.
I mean, I think if the only thing I really know to do, it sounds corny, but contact their congressman, their local congressional office, tell them they've heard about this case in Arkansas. They don't know why it hasn't been investigated, why they've never heard an explanation of what. Usually when something like this happens, at a minimum, several months down the road, you get a press conference or a news release and it says, well, we've looked at this, and as unfortunate as it was all legitimate, and here's why. Or, well, there were some failures here, and we've demoted Fred, and we've, retrained Steve, and we've got a new policy now that should prevent this from happening in the future. You expect something, but there's never been a read back on this case. It just happened, and that was it. The there, Jim Jordan and convened a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. If your listeners are interested, they should go Google Bryan Malinowski on YouTube or Bud Cummins and Bryan Malinowski. I testified at that hearing. This was only 2 months after he died, less than that, I think. And if you watch that hearing, it's entertaining. The next day, they brought the ATF director in and beat up on him, but he wouldn't comment on it. He just took the heat. And but if you listen to the opinions expressed in there, it's not, they didn't candy coat it. The congressman, it's few Democrats and a lot of Republicans uh, came on very strong. And you'd have thought, if you watched that hearing, that within days you'd have seen that kind of accountability. But that was still during the last administration, so that they were still kind of in lockdown mode. I can't really tell you why the new administration hasn't been willing to go back and revisit this, except if you read the paper, the Department of Justice is pretty busy there every day since President Trump got elected. So they're aware of it. I've made them aware that I have concerns about it. I mean, they're certainly aware of it. 30 Arkansas state senators signed a letter a few weeks ago and sent it to the President of the United States and said, hey, we haven't forgotten about this and we don't understand why somebody hasn't been held accountable. And so there's still a lot of pressure coming out of Arkansas, but it would be helpful if your audience, wherever they are, pick up the phone and call their congressman and just, there's somebody assigned to take those messages. And believe it or not, the congressman gets a summary of those and tell them that you're also concerned about this incident and you'd like to know, who's going to be held accountable.
That includes you, one person from Brazil who downloaded our podcast. I know you have a Congress as well.
My Portuguese is not very. Is that what they speak in Brazil? Portuguese?
Yeah, Portuguese.
Yeah, my Portuguese isn't very good.
It's just so funny because our entire thing is America, Sweden, probably from Spotify, and then just one person from Brazil. I need to find out what episode they listen to. All right. Bud Cummins, thank you so much for coming on. We'll put, if we can find that YouTube thing, we'll put it in the comments and everything, and information about the case as well.
Yeah, there's great clips on there. You don't have, it's, multi hours, but if you Google that, if you Google Bryan Malinowski, it's BryanMalinowski. You have to buy a vowel for Brian's name, but and Bud Cummins, which is Cummins with no G. You will get little clips of some of the congressmen and their comments, and they're insightful and entertaining and interesting.
Thank you.
All right. Well, for American Dreamland, I'm Max Chavez.
And I'm Misty Stone.